I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we talk about the latest tactical updates from the front, look at the debate in the Democratic Party in the US on the country's support for Ukraine, and we hear the shocking account of life in Russian captivity from Colin Freeman, who interviewed two recently released American volunteers who had been captured by Russian forces.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Ukraine can win, Ukraine must win, and Ukraine will win.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Tuesday, the 25th of October, day 244. And today, I'm joined by Associate Editor Dominic Nicholls, Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, and freelance journalist Colin Freeman. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Yeah, well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. Yeah, there's been a few tactical updates, actually, in the last 24 hours. So in Melitopol, down in the south, so Melitopol about 100 k's west of Mariupol, about the same distance south as Zaporizhia. Melitopol's in Zaporizhia Oblast. There was a car bomb there outside the offices of Zarmedia TV. It's a TV company. The exiled Ukrainian government officials for the region said, quote, "This is what the heating and the building of collaborators and propagandists should look like." Unquote. The pro-Moscow administration said 5 people were injured there, but it looks like, so we saw a number of alleged partisan attacks recently around the south. This might be a pickup in that campaign. We will watch that. Secondly, so in the Donbass, we know that Russia, in the form of the Wagner Group mercenaries, have been really sort of bashing themselves against the town of Bakhmut, trying to break through there in the centre with very limited success. In actual fact, Yevgeny Prigozhin, the head of Wagner, was trumpeting the Wagner line a couple of days ago on social media, which is actually slightly to the east of Bakhmut and back almost to the February the 24th line of emplacements, trenches, anti-tank ditches, vehicle obstacles, etc., etc. So, what started off in February as a 3-day lightning attack to take the country has now turned into, look at our fantastic anti-tank ditches back in 500 k's east. However, Ukrainian forces have continued to push against that line. So slightly to the north of Bakhmut, there's the town of Kreminna, which is on the main road running north-south, and that runs down into the Severodonetsk-Lysychansk area. So Ukraine have been trying to push through after their lightning assault a couple of months ago. They've been trying to continue that advance through to take that road and the town of Kreminna. They are inching closer to that. They're sort of pushing around from the north to try and cut it off. Been small incremental gains there, but it is tough going, very tough going. And the only other thing to note is that the head of Ukraine's military intelligence, General Kirilo Budanov, he's said that actually Russia is not going to abandon Kherson city and is instead reinforcing it for the battle to come. So a few days ago, we saw the new Russian overall theatre commander, Sergei Surovkin, saying that the town's going to be abandoned. Ukrainian artillery have wiped out the supply lines, etc., and that they were pulling out. Suggestions here from Budanov that actually that's all false, a deception operation, and that actually they are going to stand and fight for Kherson. Now, we've talked about this many times. Kherson obviously is the first city to fall and the only regional city to fall to Russia. So it has huge symbolic relevance to Putin and to this whole thing. It's vital if Russian forces want to get around that corner there to push sort of west through Mykolaiv and down towards Odessa, which I think is an utter fantasy at the moment, and I can't see them ever getting on the back foot again there. But the town of Kherson does have great tactical significance, not only for that, but also the city of Kherson. But if it falls, or when it's taken, the area is taken back by Ukraine, then that leads straight down to Crimea and really threatens those supply lines to Crimea, which is Russia's jewel in the crown here, and they will that would be of great significance to them. I'll take a little pause there. Lots of other things to talk about, but I'll let someone else have a go.
Thanks, Tom. Francis, can I come to you? You've got quite a few updates for us outside of Ukraine on politics. The United Kingdom has a new Prime Minister. It's former Chancellor Rishi Sunak. You've been doing some reading into his views on Ukraine. What can you tell us?
Thanks, David, and yes, good afternoon, everyone. We do have a new Prime Minister. Last week, you and I were broadcasting live as Liz Truss. The previous Prime Minister was resigning, in the process of resigning, and indeed we have seen her speak this morning outside of the famous black door of number 10 Downing Street, and her last remarks were quite punchy on the economic issues that led to her downfall, and I'll come back to that in a moment because it's relevant to Rishi Sunak. But she had some very strong words to say about Ukraine, and I'll quote her in full. Quote, "Democracies must be able to deliver for their own people. We must be able to outcompete autocratic regimes where power lies in the hands of a few, and now more than ever, we must support Ukraine in their brave fight against Putin's aggression. Ukraine must prevail, and we must continue to strengthen our nation's defences." So setting out very clearly there what she sees her vision of British foreign policy to be, and of course indirectly offering a challenge to Rishi Sunak to continue with her strong stance on Ukraine. Now, I spoke in the past about there was some concerns as to whether Rishi Sunak was quite as dedicated on the issue of Ukraine as Liz Truss. I think that's slightly unfair, but it's still right to make the point. In his speech, he did make a passing reference to Ukraine. He said something like, and I wrote it down as he said it, that the war there must be fought to its conclusion. Now, I think we're meant to deduce from that he means Ukrainian victory. But as I say, until we've seen the full transcript, where they sometimes add a few additional remarks that weren't delivered, it's difficult to confirm that. But as I say, most of his focus indeed was on the economic situation. And that, of course, is very relevant in this context too, because he said very strongly and very clearly that his priority as Prime Minister was sorting out the challenging economic and energy situation here. And that being the case, if that is indeed his priority, then he may see some tension within the British Parliament around the level of commitment to Ukraine. As I say, I still think that broadly speaking, the British Parliament is very, very robust on this. But as I say, it's something that I think is right to flag, given that the economic competency argument is something that he's driving home very, very strongly. But just to come back to his earlier remarks on Ukraine, I think it is important to stress that about 2 months ago, he gave a statement to the Kyiv Post, one of the main independent newspapers in Ukraine, for their Independence Day. And his remarks there are very, very robust indeed. So I'll quote an extract from them. This is addressing the Ukrainian people. "Your steadfast courage in standing up to aggression has given hope to peaceful and freedom-loving people around the world and sends a clear message to despots that no matter how the odds may be stacked in their favour, they will never prevail. Whatever the challenges here in our country, we Brits will always remain your strongest ally." So, as I say, reading from that, I think we can expect a very robust response from Rishi Sunak indeed.
Thanks, Francis. There's a couple of other things I'd just ask you to talk about. The German president is in Kyiv. It's a surprise visit. Can you tell us about that?
Well, yes, this is an interesting intervention by the German president, Frank-Walter Steinmeier. He's, as you say, made a surprise visit to Kyiv. Now, just to give a little bit of background on him, he's previously the Federal Minister of Foreign Affairs from 2005 to 2009, I think, and again from 2013 to 2017, as well as being Vice-Chancellor of Germany from 2007 to 2009. And this is his first to the country since Russia invaded back in February. Indeed, he was snubbed by Kyiv for his years-long détente policy with Moscow. So I think we can see this in that context as an attempt by the German state, which of course he represents, to offer a more robust stance on foreign policy affairs and to make it clear that their commitment is very much on Ukraine winning this war. As I said last week, Germany is now the third biggest donator of weapons to Ukraine, so they've come a very long way from their original policy with regards to Russia, but also into providing armaments for Ukraine. So I think this should be seen very much in that context. He's going to be meeting President Zelensky, and then he's going to visit a town in the north of the country near the Belarusian border, which Ukraine says has been liberated from Russian troops, but has been left with its infrastructure destroyed. So it's an example here, as I say, of a diplomatic visit, which is largely of symbolic value to show German commitment to Ukraine. But I'm sure there will also be some very significant conversations taking place behind closed doors.
Thanks, Francis. Can I just stay with you for one last update before we go back to Dom to talk about some final tactical updates and then come to Colin? But Francis, there's been some anger in the United States. A group of 30 House Liberals in the Democratic Party are urging President Biden to shift his strategy on the Ukraine war. Can you tell us what they've said and how much we should read into this?
Yes, big story from the US. This group of 30 House Liberals urging President Biden to dramatically shift his strategy on the Ukraine war and pursue direct negotiations with Russia. Now, this is the first time that prominent members of his own party have pushed for a change in policy to Ukraine. We spoke at length last week about the Republican Party, representatives of the Republican Party being much more critical, shall we say, of the idea of a blank check to Ukraine. But this is the first time that we've really seen a shift in attitudes within the Democratic Party itself. There's a letter sent to the White House, which was reported in the Washington Post, putting more pressure on Biden to sustain domestic support for the war effort, but at the same time mitigate that with the potentially difficult winter and the pressure electorally from the Republican Party. Now, you can imagine there's been quite considerable pushback from this letter, which many see will play into Russian propaganda. This idea of weakening Western confidence on the war, but actually I don't think that it should be read necessarily as a profound shift in American political or popular opinion. Rather, this is a very narrow wing of the Democratic Party, a progressive wing within the Democratic Party, which remains committed, in its own words, to supporting Ukraine in their fight for their democracy and freedom, but believe that there is an alternative way in which to achieve that. Quite what that is, they don't make clear, but it's clearly something around more of a diplomatic settlement. But I think this is uncomfortable reading, no doubt, for President Biden in the current context, and particularly worrisome in Kyiv as well. But as I say, no doubt in Moscow there'll be cock-a-hoop at this.
Thanks, Francis. Dom Nichols.
Yeah, I got one comment about the letter from the Democratic caucus. I mean, I don't think this is a bad intervention. I urge everybody to go and read it. It's only a page and a bit long, so I could only do it in 5 breaths. It's quite easy. Go and search for it, because if you just read the comments about it, and I've seen comments saying it's a gift to Russia. I've seen other people say no, it's really hard on Russia and it's good for Ukraine. I mean, you can take from it whatever you like. I think you need to go and read the original text, and please, I do urge you to do that. It does make the point that Ukraine has to prevail, and that this illegal and disgusting war is the fault of Putin. It goes on to it basically raises the idea that how is this war going to end? And I've said before, most wars, all wars end, and most wars end by negotiation. So, I have offered an opinion that this might be one of those wars that bucks the trend, and there's a military defeat, an outright victor on the battlefield. But you've got to consider all alternatives. And I think this letter is helpful in raising the level of conversation. Russia will, as Francis says, Russia will take from this. The Kremlin will parrot this as, there's cracks in the alliance. They're calling for Ukraine to negotiate and la 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 la. That's not what the letter says. The letter basically says to ask Biden to set out what's going on here. How does he see it ending? I spoke to Patrick Porter, professor of international security at University of Birmingham. Pat Porter 76, I think he is on Twitter. Really good guy to follow. And he was making the point that if the external supporters, I hesitate to use the West because there's lots of people not in the West who support Ukraine and want to see Russia defeated here. But if we're not prepared to physically get on the ground and fight, then where is the limit? If the limit is just to arm and fund Ukraine, okay, that might be a coherent policy position. But you've got to state that. We need our political leaders to state that, because an open-ended war with an open-ended checkbook, I mean, it just doesn't work like that. It's not the case that Ukraine is simply able to set the war aims here, and the external supporters then just keep sort of stumping up, because we have got skin in the game. We're not actively on the battlefield bleeding. I totally accept that. However, we do have skin in the game here because there is a chance at the back end of this that there could be a nuclear escalation, and we're obviously involved in that. So we have legitimate policy aims, legitimate national and international aims here. Now, at the moment, those are being exercised through support for Ukraine. But I think what this letter does is call for a more coherent discussion about what this end might look like. And the idea, Pat Porter says, so the idea of just using the word negotiation means that you're some sort of appeasement, Moscow friendly, Putiniska. I mean, it's not that. Life is never that simple. It's not one or the other. He says, this is a quote from Patrick, I'm going to be writing about for tomorrow. Anyone referring to negotiations is dismissed as fringe or isolationist. It suits the Hawks to paint anyone not supporting their position as Neville Chamberlain. And if you know Patrick Porter, you can hear him saying, Neville Chamberlain. I mean, he's a great guy. But, what he's saying is that there's got to be some middle ground. And just talking about what might negotiations look like does not mean that you are saying, Ukraine, you've got to give up. We're all sick and tired of this. It's a long, cold winter. But there's got to be room for discussion and debate to see what the rational end state of this might be. Because as I said, we're all involved here.
Well, Colin Freeman, thank you so much for joining us. We wanted to talk about a piece of yours you've written. It's up on the website. It's extraordinary. You've spoken to two US ex-servicemen who were captured in Ukraine. They were military volunteers, and you talked to them about their experience as POWs. I guess the most important place to start is, can you tell us who were they and why did they go?
Yes, these were two guys, Alex Droik and Andy Huyn. I apologise, I may have not pronounced their surnames correctly, but they're both guys from the United States, both lived in Alabama, both military veterans for serving in the US forces. Both decided to go to Ukraine to volunteer to fight with the Ukrainians as part of the International Legion, the Legion of foreign volunteers from all around the world that also includes a number of Britons, French people, folk from generally all over the place, really. Why did they go? Well, they said they were watching the early days of the war, and it felt like watching a bully bullying a kid in the classroom. That was the way Andy put it. And he said, I want to be seen as one of those kids who didn't just didn't just sit and let it happen. So off they went. They started, this was going back to about May, June time, I think. They started off as doing training missions and so on, working with the International Legion, but were keen to actually put their skills into the combat field. So they went up towards Kharkiv and spent time with a volunteer unit there, mainly of foreign volunteers, but serving under the command of the Ukrainian army. Things did not go well on their very first mission. They were in a firefight where they were ambushed or ran into a much larger group of Russian troops, so about 10 of their own guys and about 80 or so Russians. And they were duly captured. This was on June the 9th. And as you can imagine, all kinds of horrible things went through their heads. They expected that they would be executed, and they were tortured relentlessly while they were in captivity. Some pretty grim stuff, which we'll come back to in a minute. But the reason we've been able to interview them was because last month in September, they were freed in prisoner exchange, along with 5 Britons and a number of other European and North African volunteers, in exchange for, I think, something like 200 Russian soldiers, and also a prominent Ukrainian, a prominent pro-Kremlin politician, Viktor Medvedchuk, who was being held by Ukraine. So that prison swap went ahead. The guys are now back in America, recovering from their ordeal, and we did an interview with them.
So can we talk a little bit about, I mean, it's an awful thing to talk about, but what were the conditions like in their captivity? We've heard all sorts of reports about interrogation techniques and torture and conditions for POWs, Ukrainian and foreign, but could you talk a little bit about what they said their experience was like?
Yeah, sure. Well, I mean, broadly speaking, they were held for, I think, about 100 days, and the torture and the mistreatment went on pretty much for the whole time. Certainly, it was pretty bad in the first month, 6 weeks. I think that was when it was its worst. It was the kind of things you might expect: beatings, kickings, sleep deprivation, being put in stress positions for hours on end, being told they were going to be executed. When you're doing interviews like this, I should say actually that when you know that's the kind of life experience that you're interviewing somebody about, you have to really focus in on one thing. You can't really expect them to narrate the entire thing. A, because it would take forever, and B, because you're talking about potentially extremely traumatic experiences that they've been through. So I said to them, look, just talk about one or two incidents in detail. So they talked initially about the start when they were first captured. They were blindfolded and hooded, and at that point they thought they were just going to get executed on the spot. As it turned out, that was just a routine battlefield precaution, I think, in terms of taking prisoners of war. And actually the soldiers who caught them, the ones who they expected might execute them in the heat of battle, actually treated them relatively well. Soldiers, having some respect for soldiers, as they put it. But they were then taken across the border into Russia and spent a week in what they described as, and then over to the Donetsk People's Republic, the breakaway pro-Russian zone of Ukraine. And that was where things got pretty rough. And at one point in particular that they told me about, they were electrocuted. They were brought into a basement room and met with one particular interrogator who was the only one of all the people who interrogated them who did not wear a mask. And their nickname for him was Dead Eyes, because apparently his eyes were just dead and emotionless, and he looked like somebody who did not have a scrap of humanity in his soul at all, they put it. And that certainly appeared to be the case given what he did next, which was to electrocute them. He had a kind of what they described as a car battery-shaped device with a couple of metal wires on that he would clip to one clip to their ear and one clip to the metal handcuffs that they were chained in. And he would electrocute them, do it for only, I think these sessions only lasted for about 2 hours, and the electricity was only applied about 5 times for about 30 seconds per time. They're not really sure. They said, time warps when you're in that situation. But they said it felt like forever, and what looked like a fairly relatively low-powered car battery actually had a dial on it that you could dial up and down to presumably adjust the voltage. And they said it was the most exquisite pain they've ever experienced, far worse than getting a jolt from a plug or something in your house. Partly, I think, because the electricity was wired to two sides of their body. Normally, if you electrocute yourself accidentally in the home, it's because just one part of your body has touched an electrical current. I think that was probably the worst bit. Another very hard bit, though, from a psychological point of view, what they said was hearing other people being tortured in neighbouring cells and hearing screams and so on, and thinking that what on earth is going on in there, and could that be me next? They also had heavy metal music played to them. I think something about 80 songs were played in a row. mainly by a German heavy metal band called Rammstein. Their captors presumably thinking this would gradually send them mad, unaware though that both of these guys were actually big heavy metal fans in their youth, and said that one of them, Alex, said, "Oh yeah, Rammstein. I know these guys. I really like them." So that meant the noise torture was not quite as bad as it could have been, and they actually used it as a way of marking time because they were being held in windowless cells where you had no idea of the passage of time, which apparently is quite a psychologically jarring experience. But they worked out that, well, if you have 80 Rammstein songs at, say, 4 minutes each, that's roughly something like 5 or 6 hours. So if we get that for 3 times a day, then that's roughly a day has gone past, which, given what they were going through, was apparently not a bad thing by comparison to some of the other mistreatment they were getting. Just merely knowing roughly how much of how many hours of the day had passed was a bonus.
Can I ask? Well, we know from a few months ago that the Russian authorities would describe foreign fighters as mercenaries, and that's how they sort of said, right, you're getting the death penalty. Is that partly why they were treated so badly? And if not, sort of what kind of information were they trying to get from them? I guess what I'm really asking is, to what extent were they torturing them just for the sake of it, and to what extent did it have any sort of goal? Were they trying to get information from them? What was the point?
Well, when they were first caught, they both thought, like, oh God, we're Americans. Our country is arming the Ukrainian army and with weapons that are being used to kill Russian soldiers. These guys are going to give us a very hard time, and it may well be that we get executed. During the questioning, a lot of it apparently was just like, we think you're CIA, which again, I suppose perhaps not an unreasonable assumption on the part of the Russian interrogators. It became fairly clear, I think, fairly soon that they weren't CIA. And then after that, it was just a lot of apparently random questioning. And yes, it does seem like random torture just for the sake of giving them a hard time. They were also processed through the courts of the Donetsk People's Republic, and were warned that they could probably expect a death sentence. In fact, the very day that they were caught, these two Americans, death sentences had already been passed on several of the British prisoners of war who they were held alongside. So that was hanging over them as well. But it quickly became clear that the people who were holding them in the DPR, the separatists, were keen to negotiate a prison swap. And I think within a couple of weeks, actually, because I was in touch with these guys' families, which is one of the reasons why we've interviewed them. Within a couple of weeks, I think, officials from the Russian side were in touch with people from the State Department saying we want to do a deal. So it seems that certainly the death sentences were passed in order to increase their value as bargaining chips, in order to sort of say, well, look, we're not only going to let these guys free, but we're also going to spare their lives. So that just shows how generous we, the Russian side, are being, and therefore we expect some decent concessions in return.
Can we talk a little bit about how they got out? I mean, you mentioned it was in a prisoner swap, but what did it look like for going from their cells to landing back in the US? What were the sort of mechanics of that?
Yeah, they despite being allowed to make kind of proof of life phone calls home occasionally, they were generally kept in the dark about the negotiations, which, as we now know, were ultimately brokered by the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman. They were not really privy to any of that, and on the day that they were actually taken from their prison, they actually expected that they didn't know whether they were going to be taken for execution or taken to be freed. And as it turned out, that was apparently the worst day of all their time in captivity. They were bound up, handcuffed, etc., as usual, and also had plastic bags tied over their heads, and then with very little room to breathe, and then very tight masking tape bound around their heads as well, and then chucked in a lorry, I think more or less on top of each other in stress positions, and then had about an 18 or 24-hour journey to a place where they were picked up by a plane with Saudi officials on board. They said that 18 to 24-hour journey was absolutely the worst bit of the whole thing. Just the discomfort was unbelievable. And Andy actually said to me during that time, he was saying to himself, even if he had known that that freedom lay at the end of it, he said he wanted to just die at that point, anything to get out of that sort of that tortured position. So it must have been pretty hellish. They were then handed over onto this plane where they were examined by Saudi medical officials, although I don't think anything much was said at that point. They were not told, look, you're now free. And even as the plane took off, they were thinking this is all just some weird kind of setup, and we'll be 5 minutes into the air and then this plane is going to get shot down. That did not happen, of course. They were duly flown to Riyadh, but it was not until they were on the ground in Riyadh and some US embassy officials came and spoke to them that they began to really realise, to convince themselves that they were in fact free men again.
So they're now free, they're back in the US, they're recuperating and recovering from what sounds like one of the most awful ordeals you could ever undergo. What did they say about, well, they're looking back now, what are their views on it? Would they want to go back? Do they regret going? How do they talk about it now?
They are entirely happy with their decisions to go. Obviously, they said it could have worked out better, but they had no regrets whatsoever. They would also continue, actually, to urge other volunteers who have the right skills to join the fight against Russia in Ukraine. They also felt that the prisoner swap itself was, in some ways, a kind of useful way of maintaining diplomatic back channels and confidence building between the two sides. In that, as long as prisoner swaps are being continued, that does mean that there is some line of communication, some opportunity for confidence building and trust building between Russia and Ukraine and Washington. So their view was that in many ways this was not a bad thing.
Well, thank you so much for that, Colin. Thank you for your report. I would say to everybody listening, do go and read it. It's on the Telegraph's website now. Dom Nichols, can I bring you in here? You've mentioned a few times one of your roles in the army was you were an interrogation instructor. You've listened to this conversation. You've read Colin's piece. What stands out to you? What would you like to comment on?
Yeah, well, I mean, hi, Colin. Great to chat to you again. Great to have you on. I mean, just listen to this. I mean, it is horrific. I mean, there's no other way of rationalising that as a human being, sentient human being. I mean, but what this shows to me, I was a conduct after capture instructor, resistance to interrogation instructor. What this says to me is that Russia, again, they just don't know what they're doing. This is not how you treat people on the human side, right? Let's keep that in the back of our minds. That runs through the rest of my conversation. But this is not what you do as an interrogator. It's just simply not how you use, and forgive me for a moment, but use that asset of a prisoner of war. What do you want from a prisoner of war as a captor? You want information, and you want leverage. So you want information from the individual, and you want to use that individual as an asset for any possible subsequent prisoner swaps. So it makes sense to keep them alive and keep them healthy. So they can talk to you, and you don't have to tie up more assets treating them, and also you can then use them in the future. And of course, there's also the longer term sort of reputation about what they think of you, going back and the messages they pass on, and the stories in the Telegraph, and so on and so forth. But that is a minor consideration. It's what the information you can get out of them, and the value they have as an asset. So I mean, this is just torture, pain, just does not work. It's been proven over time that people will just tell you anything. What they think you want to hear under painful interrogation to make the pain stop. So it's by no means at all give you any decent information, or any information that you do get. You just can't have any faith that it's true. Now, Russian forces that are taking these two guys, Americans, or I don't know if they could tell they were Americans or Canadian or some sort of North American accent. I mean, they would know that they're not Ukrainian, and therefore they would immediately go into a sort of special category. They'd want to know a bit more about these guys. Colin says they thought they were CIA to start off with, but I mean to dismiss them immediately, such that they just treated them in the way they did, was just absolutely incompetent. And what you want to do as a captive force is maintain what's called the shock of capture. So, I mean, we talked about a little bit about this when we were looking at Mariupol and the Azovstal defenders there. And so the shock of capture is that initial shock that we all feel when we sort of try to cross the road and a car honks at us or whatever. That immediate kind of, oh my God, that cold blast through your back and through your head. That feeling of everything suddenly changed. Well, at that point for a soldier, you're at your most vulnerable then if you're in that frame of mind when you've lost control, you don't know what's happening, you're at your most vulnerable. That's when you're most likely to let slip a piece of information that you shouldn't have given, or form a bond with your interrogator that really isn't healthy. And so the idea for the interrogator is to maintain that shock of capture for as long as possible, and that's not through pain, that's not through stress positions, but it's just through messing with your head and not having any knowledge of normal stuff. So time becomes all powerful, and we were taught. I taught that for a soldier you have to count. I mean, it sounds crazy, and if you're thinking, well, I might be a captive here for years at a time, then going 1, 2, 3 to work out the time, is quite an ask. I grant you. So anything that you can hear, any ticking clocks, any movement. If there's white noise being played through loudspeakers into your cell, I remember I did an exercise once. I was being interrogated for 48 hours, and the white noise, the kind of all that noise coming through the loudspeakers, I noticed after a while that there was a glitch. It was obviously on a tape or a CD, or it was quite a while ago, as you can tell. But I could count between those, and then I just listened for that fault, and I could work out the minutes, and I could work out the time. Now, okay, this is a very minor thing, but it keeps your mind going, it keeps you active, it keeps you present, it gives you some power, it gives you some control over your life. So that thing about time is all important. Think about the music that Colin wrote about, these guys actually liking heavy metal. I mean, it's crazy to play music. If you're going to play music like that, play it backwards or put 2 tracks over the top of each other so it's a complete jumble. Don't play some music where there's a 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000, whatever chance that the bloke's going to go, oh yeah, I quite like this one. It brings these people back to the present. It gives them power, and it takes that power away from the interrogator. I'll call a halt there because I could go on at length about this. It is a fascinating subject. The psychology of it all is absolutely fascinating. But the one thing I'll end on, and Colin, there is a question mark at the end of this, so please forgive me. The thing that came out of the US experience of Vietnam is that people will talk. They will eventually crack. They will give information. The idea is to allow that to happen over as long a period as time. But you do what you have to do to survive. But the thing the Americans said, and the motto of their the MIA, the Missing in Action agencies and the veterans agencies, is return with honour. You do what you have to do to survive. Do what you have to do to get yourself back to your family and your friends. But you return with honour. You don't sell out your mates. You don't sell out your cause or your country and all that kind of stuff. You hold on to that little bit of humanity for as long as you can. As long as you can face yourself when you get home and you're on your own and you're staring at yourself in the mirror. As long as you can think to yourself, yeah, I cried, I made a mess of myself, I was completely demolished by the end of it, but I did all right under the circumstances. Return with honour, because if you do not, and this is a large experience that again came from Vietnam and all conflicts, then those issues can eat away at you, and it leads to veteran suicide and mental health issues and all the rest of it. So Colin, my question to you is: do these guys did they sound to you as if they had passed that personal test? Are they going to survive here for all the mental hang-ups that they will undoubtedly have, the traumatic stress they've been through? But do you think that they will be able to, for what little information they gave you, I'm sure there's a lot more, but do you think they'll be okay? Will they have lived up to that badge of return with honour?
My sense was yes. I mean, first of all, they were talking to me only 2 or 3 weeks after this dreadful ordeal, which I would have thought would have left most people, as quivering wrecks. they both had conduct under capture training before now, although I doubt when you're in extreme duress like this that would be of that much help long term. But they both seem pretty upbeat, and I don't think they would have been doing interviews if they hadn't been. One of them also had actually, he had served in Iraq in about 2009 with the US Army, and he had actually suffered PTSD for quite a long time after that, so much so that he was struggling to find work. And he went to Ukraine despite the PTSD being so bad that he'd actually been, he was on a full-time war veterans pension at the age of 40. And I said to him, was it a good idea? Why on earth go to Ukraine to fight another war if you're already suffering PTSD? And he said that the kind of PTSD he had, which was born out of being a top gunner in Baghdad, which, for those of you who don't know, means somebody who goes around in army convoys going through the streets, leaning out of a turret to manning a machine gun, means you're an absolute sitting duck for any insurgents or anybody else. And having worked in Baghdad at that time myself, I can tell you it's not a job I would have fancied. Chances of getting shot at, car bombed, etc., are very, very high. And he said that the PTSD he got was mainly one that just meant that all his reactions were suited to wartime, and he wasn't good at dealing with peacetime situations. And he felt that going to Ukraine might actually help him, because he would be back in a combat environment where he felt comfortable. He also said actually that he said when he was there prior to being captured, or this is what he told his mother, who had in turn told me, was that she'd said she'd had messages back from him saying, "I feel really happy. I feel glad to be here in fighting for a clear moral cause." I'm not sure that perhaps applied so easily in Iraq, where public opinion was a lot more divided. So I think going and serving in Ukraine did give him some of the sort of the moral salvation that he was seeking. It was it definitely seems to have been a boost for him. I think now that he's come out of the prisoner of war experience, I think my sense is that he will probably be okay. Although obviously it's a grim ordeal he's been through, and you're only seeing the public-facing side of someone when you interview them like this.
Well, thank you, Colin. Thank you, Dom, for your questions. Colin, is there anything we haven't spoken about these men, about what they went through, that you think is important for our listeners to know?
Just one thing, in case any listeners are wondering, well, why are we were we interviewing two Americans rather than all the British POWs? And the paper has a specific connection with these guys. When they were first taken capture, one of their friends tipped me off to the fact that they'd been caught. Their unit commander, Ukrainian commander, did not want the news being made public. Their friend took a big gamble and tipped me off. I knew him through various sort of contacts I've made out in Ukraine amongst the volunteer networks, because he was worried that they would get killed on the spot by whichever unit had taken them. And his gamble was that by putting it out in the public domain, it would mean that news of their capture was likely to filter up to the high command at the Kremlin, which would mean that they were who would probably reason that they were better kept alive than dead because of their value as bargaining chips. So we did a story on it back at the time. I mean, whether they would have been killed or not it's impossible to say. I'm not sure that the around the time that we broke the news of their capture, though, it was just when they were getting taken into the so-called kind of black prison in Donetsk, where their torture began. So it certainly didn't sort of lead to any short-term improvement in their treatment, I'm afraid.
Well, thank you, Colin, for coming on to speak to us about that. Thank you, Dom, and thank you, Francis. I know there are a few more tactical and other updates we need to talk about, so Dom Nichols, can I come to you first?
Yeah, the only other thing I wanted to mention, and sorry, I possibly should have put this in at the front was the note today from UK Defence Intelligence making mention of the number of Russian attack helicopters that have been shot down. They make they reference 23 Ka-52 NATO designation Hokum attack helicopters. These are the big, the very wide helicopters that we've seen out there operating in Ukraine. 23 have been lost over this since February the 24th, which they're saying is over a quarter of the in-service fleet of about 90. And what they're putting this down to is their inability to really put up with man-portable air defence, known as manpads in the trade. So this is, I mean, the real killer for helicopters in particular is not your super-duper anti-aircraft, this, that and the other missile. It's the person on the ground who's got a rifle that shoots at you, or a manpad, a missile. And we know that anyway. But for Russia, through their experience in the last few months, to have not got something into service quickly, this has been going on now for 8-9 months. They are unable to deal with this. And I had a good chat with a chap called Mark Vellicott on Twitter. Hi, Mark. Thanks for your comments. He was head of engineering tech at BAE Systems in Australia, so he knows a thing or two about countermeasures, and he makes the point that this lack of effective countermeasures that's not on the helicopters to start with on February the 24th, but have not been rushed into service now, such that they cannot put up with these manpad attacks. I mean, it just speaks of a really sort of constipated technical innovation line, or complete an absence of it, that Russia can't quickly put their tech minds to this problem and get something that would be clunky and won't be ideal, and it won't work with the other systems on the aircraft. But the fact they've not been able to get something on these aircraft over the last 9 months speaks that they are not able to bring in, as the British had to do and Americans and others had to do in Iraq and Afghanistan, this urgent operational requirement. There's a problem, we've not seen it before, we've not had to deal with it before, let's get something out there quickly now. They've not been able to do that, and that speaks of a real technical malfunction in their system, and it does not augur well for the fight that's yet to come, particularly down south around Kherson, where the role that these helicopters will play, the Ka-52s, that close air support to troops on the ground, they will not be able to do that properly, because they will not be able to go far forward into the actual contact zone at the front for fear of being shot down. So I thought it was a very interesting observation there by Mark on the back of today's Defence Intelligence note. But it does, I think, speak volumes about the wider Russian technical system.
Thanks, Tom. Francis Sternley.
Thanks, David. Just one story for me, if I may. It's about a 6-month investigative piece, which has just been published by the open source journalistic outfit Bellingcat, working with The Insider and the German newspaper Der Spiegel. And it's, as I say, it's a big investigative piece. It's a long read. And so I can only give a very, very brief summary of some of the details on this. And I would recommend that listeners go away and read about it in more detail. And it's about how there's a secretive group of Russian military engineers who are purportedly those who are using the high precision missiles that have destroyed playgrounds and killed dozens of Ukrainian civilians in strikes in early October. And the interesting details about this are about how perhaps some of these individuals have been recruited. Many of them seem to have had a computer gaming background, given the kind of technology that they appear to be using and the research that they've done into them, into what they were doing prior to that. There's been a lot of research using phone data about their colonel, their commander, who seems to have an interest in trading coins online. So I only mention that because it's using this kind of information, this data trail, that they have been able to connect these people and the manner in which they are connected. And it seems that this clandestine group consists of 3 different teams of approximately 10 engineers each, with each team dedicated to one specific type of high precision missile. And it appears that some of them have operated in Syria in the past, which of course I also mentioned because of the significance of that war in defining the parameters of the war in Ukraine, particularly of course with the connection of the new commander. So as I say, it's a long read, it goes into a lot of information, but I think it's really relevant, this, because it talks about the kind of investigations that are now possible thanks to the internet. It shows the system of Russian recruitment. It shows the kind of research that's going to be being conducted in the years following the war into war crimes. But most of all, I think it sends a very, very clear signal to those Russian operatives who are active in Ukraine that this isn't the 20th century. We now are able to, through the internet, through advanced technology, able to connect people and to discover who is responsible for the kind of incidents that we have been reporting now since the war began that constitute war crimes. So, as I say, this is something that I think many, many people who are operating in Ukraine should take very close attention to indeed, because ultimately it shows and underlines the point once again that in the 21st century you will not be able to get away with war crimes.
Well, thank you, Dom, Francis and Colin. So, Dom, can I just come to you first for your final thoughts?
Yeah, I just mention as final thought, we talked yesterday about the whole dirty bomb thing. Russia is claiming that Ukraine, aided by the West, in particular the US and the UK, are developing a dirty bomb to explode somewhere. A dirty bomb is, as we discussed yesterday, a conventional bomb but with radiological material, so nuclear waste effectively, normally in powder form. So it's not a nuclear explosion at all. It's a conventional explosion that can then contaminate an area. Russia's saying that Ukraine is developing one of these. Ukraine came out very quickly yesterday, and both Foreign Minister and Defence Minister Reznikov called for, or invited the UN International Atomic Energy Agency into the country to investigate the two sites that Russia said is responsible for developing this. And the news is that the UN nuclear safety inspectors are due to arrive shortly. That was a quote this morning from Dmitry Kuleba, the foreign minister, due to arrive shortly to have a look at those sites. And he thanked the IAEA for their prompt response. I think that shows how seriously the world is taking this in terms of debunking Soviet. Blimey, there we go, paging Dr. Freud. Russian misinformation here. Actually, it's the same thing. I think it's very serious that the talk of dirty bomb and these false flag attacks that we think Russia was lining up to blame Ukraine for an attack, either just to discredit Ukraine, but then also possibly to be able to retaliate in some way. So the world has been very united in pushing back against this narrative that Ukraine is developing a dirty weapon. Interestingly, we're expecting Russia's UN ambassador Vasily Nebenzia today, their representative on the UN Security Council, to take. He says he's going to take some proof to the UN Security Council of all these claims. I mean, it's interesting. Look at Nebenzia. I mean, so he's on the UN Security Council. Suddenly sees that as a really important body to take these claims to. Bear in mind, he stormed out of the UN Security Council just back in June when the European Council President Charles Michel accused Russia of using the grain supplies, the food supplies, as he called it a stealth missile against developing countries. Nebenzia couldn't handle that and walked out. So, on the one hand, he's walking out of this UN Security Council, and Russia are not accepting that this body is there to try and contain the worst of humanity in the 21st century. And now he's going back and saying, oh, no, actually, we do need it. It's really important that we have all this proof. And so I think we can just see in that Russia are doing whatever they can, using whatever levers they can, pushing any buttons to try and maintain this narrative, not only just over this dirty bomb, but just generally. They'll try whatever they can. It doesn't work. They get called out. They don't like it. I think we just need to, as I said the other day, we just need to hold the line here, be concerned but not scared by these claims. I don't think there will be a dirty bomb attack. But I think this is Russian propaganda really pushing it as far as they can go, and I think they've been quite surprised at the united front that came back at them very, very quickly from the world's response.
Well, thank you very much for that, Dom. Francis Sternley, thank you so much for your time. Would you like the final words?
Thanks, David. I just wanted to end again on the new British Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. And since we've been on air, President Zelensky has tweeted his congratulations. But I just wanted to draw attention to a particularly noteworthy response from India. His election is on the front pages there, and Prime Minister Modi has tweeted his personal congratulations. And I think this just underlines the opportunity that Rishi's elections offers for Britain and the West. His background, he's of Asian heritage, he's a practicing Hindu, is something that really underlines one of the central post-Brexit policies of the Conservative Party, which is this idea of global Britain, one that's not just constrained in the European context. So there's that side of it. But there's also the fact that his background, he was a former chancellor, somebody whose career was in banking. So his sort of technocratic and economy-focused side will also appeal to Brussels and to the European Union, and many comparisons have already been made with the French President Emmanuel Macron. So in many ways, he offers a fresh start for Britain on the world stage, and we just have to hope that he doesn't waste that. But the other thing I think that's just worth underlining in the India context, is I've spoken about in the past, is that there are the various UN votes that have taken place where India has abstained on the issue of Russia and whether to condemn them outright. And I think that, as I say, in this context of a new British Prime Minister, someone who clearly wants to work very closely with Prime Minister Modi, one hopes that there may be some opportunities afforded there for an improved dialogue with India, and maybe, just maybe, persuading them to condemn Putin in stronger terms.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. You can also listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter to make sure you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And, if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message. And we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world.